Hey, everybody. Welcome to another great evening event here at the Poison Pen. My name's Patrick. I am your science fiction and fantasy selector here at the Poison Pen. And tonight we have a really great program with I wouldn't call him new and budding anymore. Nick, this is your second book, but
Yeah.
this is Nick Martell. Nick, welcome so much to the Poison Pen Digital Edition. And thanks for joining us on your, what is today? Thursday evening.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's a great time. I'm always like, this is kind of stuff that I like doing because it's like I can talk about my books some more. Like this is my favorite topic. So
That's exactly it. And tonight, so one of the fun things that we're going to be doing is talking with you about your newest book, The Two-Faced Queen, and we'll also be taking some questions and Q&A from the audience. For those of you who are watching right now, feel free to go ahead and submit your questions as Nick and I are talking. And when the time comes, we'll go ahead and break away and ask some of your questions as well, or just write some really nice comments because it is always nice to share those as well while Nick is here. I'm sure he'll come back and take a look at our Facebook feed and see what you guys wrote on the side. So always be nice. Um, Nick, congratulations. So The Two-Faced Queen is the second in your series. It is part political thriller. It is high fantasy. It's got assassins. It's got just about everything. You threw
yeah.
the kitchen sink at us without actually, throwing a kitchen sink. Um, what inspired you to start your series and to write two great books so far in a duology?
Yeah. Honestly, the thing that really inspired me to write the series whole was I really wanted to be the story of a boy to a man to a hero to a legend to a myth, and a myth to a legacy, kind of that order. Like full to tell the full story of someone's life from pretty much like not beginning, but like pretty much beginning to end. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about that is I actually started with the ending. So I came up with the idea for how this story would end, and I kept like thinking and almost daydreaming in my classes, where it's like, oh, how do I get go to back to the beginning? So I really came up with it that way, and I just really wanted to show like how like legacy kind of defined people in kind of unexpected ways. And honestly, I just kept throwing stuff I liked into the books. I think I wrote about 8 books before The King of Liars got published, and the way I did it is I kind of just took the best aspects out of every book I finished and just brought them on to the next one. It was like, all right, this book wasn't very good. Oh well, this part of it was. Let me put it in the next book and just keep moving forward. So sometimes characters made it to the end, sometimes magic did, sometimes locations and plot points did. But I just kept rewriting, essentially writing different books, but keeping constant strand until the Kingdom of Liars became the Kingdom of Liars, and then the Two-Faced Queen.
That is awesome. So you essentially had written 8 books before you became a published writer. Um, I've got to ask you, how bad was your first book?
Oh, it was so bad. It was the worst book you imagine. It was like a Harry Potter knockoff, but not even like a good Harry Potter knockoff. I think I had written it right after I read Ender's Game, which is I think one of the novels that really inspired me to be a writer. It was like, oh, this was so good, and I think a lot of people have that instinct of like when they read something so good, they're like, I want to write something too. I want to like do that too. And Ender's Game was that book for me. And then I just kept writing something. But the first book was so bad. Like I found it actually, at least the first chapter of it, and I just read it. And I was like, oh, this is so bad. I keep saying that, but there's really no way to describe it other than that.
It's funny that you say that though, because I think Ender's Game is one of my top books of all time, but it is one of the hardest books and one of the grimmest books you can read as an adult.
Yeah.
And one of those books that you take a lot away from as maybe a teenager, but then you take even more so away as an adult. And I find that that is one of the hardest books to actually read because it's so weighty in so many
Yeah.
ways. So to follow that up and have that though inspire you to become a writer shows testament to to Ender's Game and to Orson Scott Card's style of writing. Um, had you always wanted to be a writer then, or was that the book that inspired you to become a writer?
No, like I actually had a very complicated relationship with reading and writing. I wasn't really good at reading for a lot of my early life. Like it wasn't really up until about fourth, maybe end of fourth grade or early fifth grade that I started actually liking reading and writing. And the book that actually made me into a reader was Frindle by Andrew Clemens. It was one of the books we had read. My teacher gave us to read, and it was something about, I don't know if you remember the cover of it, but it's like a kid with like essentially orange curly hair and glasses. And back then, that was exactly how I looked. So I saw myself in this book, and I just absolutely loved it. And then from there, I kind of just read everything he had written and slowly moved on to other books. And then there's eventually fantasy books. So like I always like to credit some books being like, oh, these are the books that like made me into a writer. But I wouldn't say anything without Frindle. I don't become a reader, and I don't become a writer then.
Well, and you can't be really a great writer without being a good reader to begin with, because you're going to be you almost by osmosis.
Yeah.
You're learning the craft. You're learning how to write. You're learning dialogue and what you like in terms of plot, what you don't like in terms of plot. S but I find that writing fantasy is probably one of the most challenging um, genres for a writer to really write. Um, we hear a lot from mystery and thriller writers who said, I love reading fantasy. I don't think I could ever write it because there's so much complexity that goes into developing an entire fantasy novel. And to do that well is quite the challenge. Um, who were some of your inspirations as a fantasy reader uh, for um, for kind of developing this love of the genre?
Yeah, I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention Christopher Paolini. Like I think he is attributed with like getting probably hundreds of thousands of kids into the fantasy genre with Aragon, and yeah, like I like without that book, I probably still don't become a fantasy reader. But big influences otherwise are like Robin Hobb. I love her Farseer trilogy and everything she's written in that universe. Brandon Sanderson, obviously, like Way of Kings blew me away the first time I read it. Let's see what else. The Del Toro Quest, which were these kind of more chapter books. That was such a great series. Like I remember the first time I like saw those covers and like for the dragon and all like collecting the gems. Harry Potter too. Like there's so many books that I read, and they're all like I can like kind of piece them back in my head where I'm like, these are the books that kind of like made me into a writer, and these are the books I read. Name of the Wind. I probably just look beyond my bookshelf and start plucking out books. To be honest, like
You could do an entire podcast based off of your library. It sounds like it's pretty
yeah,
extensive.
yeah. There's so many books because especially as like a kid, all I did was read. Like I played video games, I read, I pretty much did schoolwork, I hung out with friends. And when I was that young, like I could just like had so much time to read. I'd be going through like books a week or like books a day almost.
It's amazing when you look at what you could read and what you could get through
Mhm.
sometimes as a kid versus what we have in terms of time as an adult now. I know that this is my fun job, and I have a serious job during the weekday. And so for me, my time reading is a little bit more limited, and but working here, it's good excuse for taking time out actually
Yeah.
reading a book. I'm reading for my for what I enjoy and for what to sell books and to talk with authors like yourself. Um, so for me, it's a real joy to sit down and read, get completely lost in a good fantasy.
Yeah.
That's my thing. I love great epic fantasy. And one of the things I really loved about the Two-Faced Queen is the fact that you mentioned Robin Hobb as an inspiration, and I really enjoyed the Assassin series that she wrote, Assassin's Apprentice series,
Yeah.
because it's the creation of an assassin. Same with Brent Weeks. Uh,
Yeah.
I happen to like fantasies with assassins. I think that's really cool. and the two-faced queen, and you've got your main character becoming an assassin, and so that's a really cool piece of your book. So what was the inspiration, and how did you develop him into becoming an assassin?
Yeah, so the way I kind of wanted to develop Michael, who's the main character, I really wanted to take him from something that he had like a political position in the city. He has like, if people know him, he's a noble lineage, and but he's really kind of on the outskirts now. So when I was developing him, I kind of wanted to make him something that could navigate through a lot of different people and different like societies and stuff, because once you kind of narrow them into something different, I didn't want to feel restricted. Like if I made him more of like, let's say, example, like a knight, he would kind of be regulated to more of like the noble circles. Or if I made him someone like just a rebel, he would be more like associated with those circles. So making him something that was more kind of free form that can go through and out people in society and the circles in the city and all like the opposing forces just allowed me as a writer to be able to like show all the sides of the conflict rather than being kind of like narrowly focused on something, which gives like the huge city is like alive and there's so many things that even he's not aware of or doesn't really interact with, but you kind of as a reader will still be able to see them like, oh, there's this thing going on here, there's this thing going on here, and you get to kind of see like how it all kind of meshes together, and it's all the messy complicated chaos that's within this world.
Absolutely. And so it kind of gives him the chance to see both sides of the conflict that's going on within your book. And I really like that because when he's surprised as a reader, we're surprised. Um,
Yeah.
and go
Oh
ahead.
no, I was gonna say like the one of my favorite things about the books, like as from the writer, but also like as a reader, is that the reader is so closely tied to what Michael knows and doesn't know,
Mhm.
that like I get to do a lot of cool things with it. I get to mess around with his memories and how he perceives and sees events. And the reader may not always be aware of what they're happening, but in the background, it gets to be like, haha, you'll figure out what this means in the next book. Or like the Two-Faced Queen, like some things paid off the things that people have read in the first book, and like, and then now if you read the first book, you'll see things that the second book you wouldn't have if you haven't read the second book. So there's always this kind of layers on layers on layers that I really like in storytelling.
So, and when you were coming up with the ideas that you said you were pulling from your best,
Mhm.
first 8 books that you wrote. Um, so, I mean, that really allowed you to develop as a writer yourself. How structured were you when you created the Kingdom of Liars and the Two-Faced Queen? Um, in terms of building that story, were you really rigid, or did you keep yourself pretty free flowing?
The way I kind of describe my writing process is kind of like taking a road trip across the United States. So I know, like, say I'm going to start in New York, and I really want to see Chicago, Las Vegas, and maybe like Tennessee while I'm there. And I want to end in like, let's say, California, like maybe Los Angeles. So I know I'm going to stop in these cities along the way, and I know where my ending is, but I'm not quite really sure which roads I'm going to take. Like I may take a detour and be like, oh, you know what? I really want to go to the Alamo when I'm down Texas rather than head the northern trails towards Seattle. And those kind of things are allowing me to kind of be more freeform, but also it has a very rigid structure of like, I know where my ending is. I know where everything's coming to. And allows me to have like more of those like avalanche endings. Like one of the things I'm really like priding myself on is that once readers hit a certain point in my books, they shouldn't be able to put it down. Or like that's what I'm hoping for, at least, that as long as no like outside forces interfere, because it should just be like one thing after another that really compels them forward. So doing that, I kind of needed a rigid structure, to be able to get to those kind of endings. But at the same time, I didn't want it to be too rigid where like you almost the characters didn't have time to breathe. I wanted to give them a lot of those quiet moments, or like those moments where they can kind of be investigating things. Because the way I wrote the Two-Faced Queen, especially, is that I consider the first half of it more of like the investigation part, like where they're trying to solve these mysteries. And the second half is kind of like there's no more mysteries. Now it's just all action. We're trying to like survive to the end. So it allows me to do both of those things. It's kind of the best of both worlds.
One of the things I liked, really, I loved about the Two-Faced Queen was the fact that you brought in a really rich sense of mystery, the investigation, almost a police procedural sort of idea behind how you're building that mystery and how they're doing the investigation. Um, and I'm always surprised when I end up hearing from mystery readers, well, I don't read fantasy because it's too out there. I think to myself, there's so much mystery, there's so much that you're gonna like in a fantasy, and I feel like the Two-Faced Queen would be a great introduction for those kinds of people who don't believe that genres really cross and they really meld, and they do a great job to do that. So kudos to you
Thank you.
on doing that. I thought that was a lot of fun. And at the same time, you really do ratchet up a lot of suspense, especially towards the end of the book.
Mhm.
And during this interview, I don't want to go into too much detail because we don't want to spoil with the
Yeah.
audience. I have done that before, and it is not fun. So I try to avoid talking too deeply. And so, audience, please understand when we don't, because we don't want to ruin the book and your experience. But I've got to ask you, what inspired the mystery within your book? Um, and how did you go about developing that mystery within a fantasy subtext?
Yeah. So I like thrillers and mysteries a lot. And one of the things that it's kind of like almost like a guilty pleasure. Like, oh, I kind of like these things where it's like, I find like I find serial killers like utterly fascinating, and like they make no sense to me. Like Mindhunter, the TV show, I think it's a great example where they try to like figure out like what kind of like these killers, what goes on in their head. So to me, it was kind of like, all right, I'll just try one in a fantasy setting. And that really like was kind of the basis for it. And then obviously like when I put those kind of things in a fantasy setting, I have to make it work. Like it's still a mystery. So there has to be rules, there has to be things of how they operate and stuff. So that's not too spoilery. I don't know if I can say much else
Yeah,
without it, but I designed it essentially like a mystery novel, in that kind of way where it's essentially a mystery novel in a fantasy setting with fantasy rules, but the basis of it still is that mystery thread of who did what.
I tried writing one once. It was garbage. It was complete garbage. So I've got to tip my hat to you
Thank you.
for that. So that was actually the first thing I ever tried to write. Oh no, no, that will never see any sort of light of day or any reader's eyes other than my own. Um, so in terms of but it does fit so well in terms of doing the investigation and developing the serial killer. Can you give me an idea of what you did to get into your characters' heads and the serial killer's head to write them? Because that's a very dark place to be when you're trying to come up with a serial killer or somebody so depraved as the character that you created.
Yeah. So at least with Michael, it's kind of Michael's a fun character, right? Um, and because he's kind of just like so headstrong and just doesn't always think things through. He's almost got that he's got that old school, like almost the old school classic beat cops who are just like, I'm gonna go charge straight into the thing, not thinking through. And you're just like, no, don't do that. Don't do that. But so like Michael is I have a love-hate relationship with my main character because I spend so much time in his head that sometimes I'm just like, well, we should could just do something a little bit smarter this time. Just like a little bit. Like I get why you're doing it, but like, could you just take this other ways? Every time it's like, nope, gotta do this way. I'm like, all right. But the serial killer thing was I was lucky in that I never actually had to spend like I never wrote a POV from the serial killer. And I think that kind of allowed me to have separation between the dark acts in which the character is committing and what the readers will see. Because while I had to go into the depth of like this character is doing some really terrible things and like they say terrible things and their whole like persona or how they act and what they've done is something I would never really want to have to write a POV from, but I if I had to for the sake of story, I would. But it's kind of just like I think I just read, like, I went and read comics after I wrote anything about the serial killer, where I was like, you know what I need right now? Superman or Green Lantern. Let me just like get a palate cleanser. Um, but no, I think you eventually read a bunch of like mystery or watch shows, and these things would have these like more darker elements into it. And you can kind of separate yourself by the act and like what's happening, but you still have to make it convincing. So I did my best to make it convincing.
See, I never try to, like, I can read mysteries and thrillers. With serial killers, no problem. Watching them on television, I can't do it past like 7 or 8 o'clock because it just gets my
Really?
mind too much. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
in terms of writing, when were the best time for you to actually write either those scenes or the entire book? Did you have a set time where you would sit down and actually write your book?
I tend to write better in the morning. So usually once I wake up, I write forever how long it works. Like sometimes I hit my daily writing goals where it's like, when I was writing Two-Faced Queen, I had about a goal of about 2,000 a day. But I hit that goal, I was like, cool, I'm done. I don't have to try to write, and I was like, think about what I'm doing next. Because I truly believe like thinking is almost half as important as the actual act of writing, as long as you're doing the writing part. So it allows me to kind of like almost the stories to stew in my head while I'm doing other things. So I wrote mainly in the morning, but there were times where I'm like, it was like after midnight, and I'd like wake up and I'm like, all right, I gotta write this down right now before I forget it. Or I'd be writing on my phone, like my phone. I'm terrified some days to lose it because I'll like write down descriptions of things. I'll just be like watching TV, like or bad reality television, and I'll just be sitting there being like, da, 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 da. I'll like write it down, put it down, and I'm like, I'll never remember that unless if I lose my phone. So I'm always writing, I guess.
That's exactly it. But you've got to give your brain sort of that break and allow it
Mhm.
to sort of bubble up and come up with its own solutions to these problems as you're writing them through. But then you have to take advantage of when that solution comes to jot it down at least so that you don't forget. I know that I do that in my day job. I help build EMR systems for a hospital, and every so often you get a really tricky problem. And you're like, okay, how am I going to solve this? And you go off and you do something else. I'm at the grocery store, and the next thing you know, it's like, oh, that's how I do it. That's how I'll handle it. And you got to jot it down, or I'll pull out my phone and just do, a quick note on my notepad in there, and then
Oh
go on
yeah,
from there. But
walks are the best time to, if you ever want to solve a problem, go take a walk.
exactly. So, so you're writing in the morning. What now? Obviously, with the Kingdom of Liars, and maybe even with the Two-Faced Queen, did you have a day job that you were doing as well as writing? And are you still doing that?
During the Kingdom Liars, I did. Two-Faced Queen, I did not. It was like wrapping it up pretty much. I do not have a day job right now, so I actually get to do this full time, which is kind of exciting. I hope I can keep doing it full time. But yeah, I was lucky enough that I was in a position where I was kind of like, well, I can invest my full time in writing. And it was my dream, and it's still my dream. So I kind of took advantage of it. I live pretty cheaply, so I can do this thing right now. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, you've got to live. The exciting thing is when you're able to move from being a full-time or part-time writer into a full-time writer, because sometimes success takes a little bit of time to build up. And we talk to a lot of writers where they still do their day job during the day. And some are lucky enough to do, if they're a morning writer, they get to write in the morning, and then they go to their job in the afternoon or after work, and they fit it in. And sometimes we write to 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning to make this their profession,
Yeah.
um, or their love, obviously. And you've got to love to write in order to be a writer. Um, we've talked a little bit about the fact that you've been writing since you were
It was like fifth grade or something.
fifth grade. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the best and the worst. But what I'm really interested in is, when did Kingdom of Liars finally like gel and be like, this is the book I need to write?
um, it I think it started gelling in my about junior year of college. I was just, I was in college, I was swimming, I was about to go study abroad, and I was like, I had just finished another novel from about fifth grade onward. I wrote about a novel every 2 years. So I was on my pace, and then I was coming up with the idea like, all right, what do I want to take from the previous novel that didn't work? What am I going to do with this one? And it really came up with the main thing that inspired the King of Liars was the idea that magic costs memories and how that would affect everything. And the way I came up with it, it was just me and a friend almost arguing with each other where how something happened in the past. We both were just like, no, it happened this way. No, it happened this way. And I left the conversation, obviously on good terms with the guy, but the thing kept staying in my head where it was like, we both remember it differently. Like, and we eventually went to a third source who like said, no, it happened this way. And I was wrong. And I kept thinking, I'm like, no, I knew that was how it happened. And that's kind of like almost like idea burrowed in my head and just like wouldn't let go, where I was like, oh man, what if I just created an entire magic system that was kind of not trustworthy, where like the people would keep losing what they thought happened or like memories of things and how it would affect everything. And then from there, it kind of snowballed out of control up until the point I had finished the book. And at that point, like I said, I had written 8 books. By the time I got down to that one, I was like, no, I think I could sell this. It was the first time I'd ever been like, I think I can actually sell this book now. And it wasn't something I was actually planning on doing at that time. I kind of always thought of being a writer as like almost like a long-term goal where I was like, I'm going to be a writer someday. But then once I read that book, wrote that book, I was like, no, I think I can actually do it now. Maybe like someone will want to see what the book has and like help me sell it and help me get it published. And sure enough, it did. There's more revisions after that. It was not like oh, this is genius. Let me go straight and sell this. But I was lucky enough that I found people who supported me and like saw what I saw in the book and helped me like turn it into what it is now.
That is so cool. Now, did you write The Kingdom of Liars and immediately start writing The Two-Faced Queen before you had a contract, or did you wait until that contract was signed to start the second book?
I waited till about it was time to do it. I remember when we sold the series. And while I was on submission, I was talking to my agent about, oh, what do I write next? He's like, oh, write something completely different. Don't worry about the sequel yet. If we like sign the contract, then you worry about the sequel. And I was like, all right. And then my submission process was very short. And then I remember talking to him, being like, I have like 5,000 words of like something else I was supposed to write. Do I continue with that? He's like, no, you got to write the sequel, Nick. I'm like, all right. But I revised the King of Liars and was writing the sequel at the same time, which is kind of almost the pattern you fall into once you get published and like have contracts where it's like you're almost always revising a book and then you're always almost working on another book. And it's kind of this weird pattern that you don't really know how to operate at first, but then it's kind of just like rolling. Like, oh, I got copy edits today. Oh, I got like major edits I got to work on. I'll put this book aside. Let me think about it, and then I'll come back to it once I'm done with this stuff.
Now, in the world of COVID, I mean, we'd hear about authors having to go to New York because that's where all the big houses are. Were you actually doing a lot of this pre-COVID, or were you actually having to do like Zoom conferences and things like that with your editors?
Well, I was lucky. I lived in New York at the time. So I lived on Long Island specifically. So to me, it was just a train ride away. And at most of it, I was actually like working in New York City, not around so I was able to actually like pretty much like meet these people when I needed to. So that made things easy. It did. And as an advantage, not everyone has, and something I just did, but I'm grateful for the opportunity because it felt like it allowed me to almost meet the people I'd be working with face to face. I got to meet my editor before he had actually offered me a contract. So I got to like develop that relationship with him, which was really nice.
That is really nice because I think the editor-writer relationship is really important. What was it like having your first book completely edited? Was it a painful process? Was it hard? Or was it, because we often say it takes a village to publish a novel, right? Was it hard to see that editorial process the first time around?
The edits themselves wasn't hard. They kept pushing me like, oh, you got try this, try this, try this, and I kept pushing it. Um, I think by the end, by the time I wrote about, I want to say 15. There are 15 major drafts of the Kingdom of Liars before it eventually hit print. And by the end of it, I was broken mentally. I was like, please don't say we're doing another round of major revisions. I'll do them, but I'm slightly broken here. I remember I told my editor, I was like, she's like, I think this is the last major one. I'm like, please, thank you. I'm done. I'm like, I'm at my limit here. But that was just the King of Liars. The Two-Faced Queen only had about I guess three major drafts of it. So I got down from 15 to 3, which really, I'm just improving my writing abilities, I guess.
The funny thing is that by doing that work, I think you probably ended up realizing that those were things that you needed to change. Those were things that you needed to update, which is always hard because you're so close to that book, right? And to have somebody read through it and say, yeah, make these adjustments or do that. Did you feel by the end of that editorial process that your book was that much better, though, by the time
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, not a doubt in my mind. Like my editors like improved the book majorly. Like that's one thing I'm 100% confident in, is that at the time they pushed me to my utmost abilities on what I could do with that book. And it's actually funny now where I'm looking back where I'm like, oh, if I could have done that or done that, and I have to get out of that mad where I'm like, no, that book's done. Like there's nothing more to that book. But there's something I think it was Brandon Sanders who said, is that art never really ends. Like you always like can improve something, but eventually you have to let go of something. And to me, the Kingdom of Liars and the Two-Faced Queen perfectly represent my utmost abilities at that time in my life, and it perfectly calculate who I was then, what I wanted to do then, to what my abilities of writing were. So even if they're not like the absolute perfect for everyone, they were to me, and they were my best abilities, and I'm really happy with what I put out there. So
that is, and in terms of that, I mean, because you put in so much work, you got something that I very rarely see any author get, and that is two really good reviews from Kirkus. Um, we talked about this just a little bit
yeah,
before the event, but they're really critical. They are hard, and they've got that notoriety of being very hard to get a great review from. But both the Two-Faced Queen and the Kingdom of Liars got really great reviews.
yeah.
That's exciting. That is so exciting to see. Um, what was it like when you discovered you got so many good reviews from all these different Publishers Weekly did a really nice write up on your books. Um, you've gotten some really great attention on your writing.
Yeah, I know we talked about it before, but initially when I entered publishing, I had no idea what what these reviews meant or what they like kind of signified. I kind of thought they're like, oh, there's people reviewing it, and then you learn more about it, and you're like, oh, okay, each one has their kind of own style, what they act, and like how they are more critical or more like nice and those kind of things. Like every kind of like Published Weekly, Library Journal, Kirkus kind of has its own like flair and style. So initially, when like the Kingdom Liars was getting reviews and Kirkus gave it a really nice review, I was like, "Oh, this is awesome!" And people were like, "No, Nick, that's a big deal." And I was like, "Yeah, they liked it." And like at the time, I was like, I didn't know the full severity. But by the time the Two-Faced Queen came out, my editor called me and he's like, "Hey, like Nick, you got to start a review from Kirkus for the Two-Faced Queen," and I was like speechless. And he's like, I just want you to know, like, this is also what they said about you. They like said it's a masterclass in fantasy and grand scale fantasy. And I'm like, you think I'd have that quote memorized by now, but a little tongue twisted. And I was like, they called me what? And they kind of, yep, they called you the future of epic fantasy, Nick. And I was like, are you sure? Like me? Like they do someone else? And like he's like, no, Nick, it was you. And I'll send you the review once I can too. And I saw it. I was like, I knew how big of a deal it was, and it was kind of like it was hit during the middle of COVID, or like for the end of COVID. It was a long year for a lot of people, And that was like almost like the first moment, like, you know, like that phrase was like, oh, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. And in that moment, I think I actually did let out a breath and I was holding. I was like, all right, people are getting it. Like it's been a rough year, a long year, but like because someone like saw what I was doing, it made my year.
You know, the funny thing is that COVID unfortunately sort of derailed all of publishing, right?
Mhm.
Things got moved around. Things happened that we weren't expecting to have happen. And one of the strangest things for us is we were so used to having authors come in for their book tours. You know, we here at the store, everything's on wheels, so we can turn the entire store into an auditorium, and we do that almost nightly, about 250 to 300 programs here in house a year
Awesome.
in the evenings. And so you're so used to tearing down the store and breaking it down, and getting an audience in front of the author, I think is really, really important so that people can learn from you about you word of
Mhm.
mouth. And so that was something that was really hard for us to get used to, is doing these promotions remotely. um, when COVID ends and you don't have to do as necessarily as many digital interviews, would you want to do personal interviews, like travel around and do a legit book tour,
Oh
physical
yeah.
tour?
Oh yeah, 100%. Like I that's one of the things I actually kind of like still like it's really sad about. Around the time that COVID happened, like I found out my book was getting delayed. Initial one was going to be in May, and then it got delayed to June for the physical for various reasons. And I found that back out in March. And during that time, it was right around when things were shutting down. Like I remember the first major thing I can remember was like the NBA's done. And me and my roommate were talking about it, be like, the NBA just shut down. Like COVID's a way bigger deal than we thought it was going to be. And then it slowly like trickled down where it's like I was supposed to do an in-person signing at my local comic book store I had grown up next to. Me and the owner were friends, and he's like, we're gonna have like this cool thing happen. We're gonna have these signs. It's gonna be free comic book day. We're gonna put you in front of people. Your book's gonna sell so quickly, Nick. It's gonna be great. And then he like messaged me like, hey Nick, like I assume you already know, but we gotta cancel this. Like it's getting real over here. And I was
Yeah,
like, yeah. And then slowly, one by one, it was just kind of like this thing wasn't happening. This thing wasn't happening. This thing wasn't happening.
right. Just
Yeah.
all those events. Yeah, I was really disappointed. Our Phoenix Fan Fusion is what it's called now. It's
Yeah.
a Comic Con basically. Uh, got canceled, and you know we would throw a party with a lot of the writers who would be coming for that here at the bookstore, and so we didn't get to do that, um, which was really a shame. And it really changed sort of the face of how we got to promote your books. So it's exciting when we can actually talk about a book we're really really enthusiastic with the author. One of the things that you probably know is that we've chosen this as our science fiction fantasy book of the month
Yes.
with our book club. Um, and for those of you who aren't aware, budding authors like Nick Martell, who will one day be, you know, the big authors of fantasy, um, you could have gotten his second book in signed, and we still have a few copies left that you can order of the Two-Faced Queen. Uh, but if you sign up for our science fiction fantasy book club of the month, um, certain books we can only get so many books signed, and you are the ones who end up getting them. So the more that you support it, the more you do that, the more we get science fiction and fantasy here in the store, and we also are able to promote books that you like to read. Um, Paula McDonald had a really good question, and we know that this is going to be a trilogy.
Mhm.
Do you think you're going to extend this into more books, or is it sort of a thing that you don't know yet, or you can't discuss?
Um, so I've always had a plan for Michael from the very beginning, and I've had that strict plan. I've told my publishers, my editors, that this is how I want to take his entire story. And at this moment, I'm still on that plan. I wrote the third book with that intention. So we'll see. I can't really speak about that because those things are like beyond me. Like this is what I want to do, but publishing is kind of always like well, we'll see what happens. But one of the things that I really like that I've set up in this world, and one of the things I get to hopefully do is that I designed it in a way that I can kind of move country to country to country to country if I really wanted to. So I could set a country in a different place, set a series in a different place in this country, and then I could go to this country, and I could have characters from different series, interact with them, and not be major characters, but you could still see the characters eventually. I kind of call it the almost the way Discworld did it, where you could jump in Discworld with all of these different places, and you'd see various threads coming together, but you didn't have to follow it from the very beginning. Because one of the things that I really want to hopefully aspire to is that I want to be able to almost provide multiple entryways onto a series for readers, so that even if they're like, oh, this really isn't my cup of tea, oh, I'm going to maybe join on this way. This sounds more of like what I like or what I want to read about. So it helps the readers kind of find what they like. Also, it allows you to like explore this whole world. But I say that and I'm like, want to write a standalone next. So like I clearly don't know sometimes what I'm talking about.
You've got to refresh the palette, right?
Mhm.
So I think that's part of it. I think as a writer, you've if a standalone is what is drawing you next, that's what you should write, because you need that palette cleanse from the world, which allows you to prepare for the next book within the series. It also prevents some reader fatigue, a
Yeah.
little bit. And that's something you kind of have to think about in the back of your mind as a writer. Um, if I'm getting tired of writing about this location, the reader's going to get a little tired of this location. Um,
Yeah. And one of the things, and maybe this is just the more publishing side of me leaking through, is like, look, fantasy series can sometimes be really long. If I just like want to put out a standalone and be like, this is it. This is the whole story. There's nothing more. There's no prequels. There's no sequels. You just got to read one book.
mhm.
As a reader, it's appealing to me, because like as we talked about stories, like sometimes you just can't read all the books, and sometimes I forget what happened in the series I love. If I like, it's been a long time between books are out, or even it's just like I just don't have the time to read sometimes the books that are coming out. So like, yeah.
Right. Or if you get fatigued with this series and it
Mhm.
takes you years and years to write that next book because trying to you're trying to maintain a level of consistency, which is hard, especially with books that are 6, 7, 800 pages sometimes. If you don't want to drag the reader down, you want to make each page count, so to speak. Um, that can take a while to write. So sometimes you need something that's gonna to fill you in. And as a reader, if it takes you that long, sometimes you have to go back and reread the entire series so you're ready to read that book. One
Yeah.
of the things I really liked in The Two-Faced Queen, we talked about it really
Mhm.
shortly before we started, was the fact that you write a what happened so far at the very beginning. And
Yeah.
yeah, tell me a little bit about what inspired you to do that.
I did it partially just because it's what I wanted in books, especially series that there's so many books out there, so many series that I sometimes just need a refresher on what character has done what or which character is who. And the story so far segment I wrote was kind of like, hey, look, this is like all the information you need. It doesn't actually give away the big twists in the first one, actually. It lets the reader actually come to the conclusion by themselves. And this was kind of a way to prevent, like, if I wanted to read, like, a reader just opened it up, they wouldn't spoil the first book if they wanted to go back and read it first, but it also wouldn't halter or limit someone being like, oh, I'm just going to continue on from here. So I really want to like make it as easy as possible for readers to pick up these books. And I really like wanted this book to almost not have a standalone feel, but it's kind of like the same thing. It's like the easiest way I want to make my job as easy for the readers who can pick up a book and be like, I haven't read The King of Liars in like 2 years, which I guess can't be a thing considering it came out like less than a year ago. But I wanted them to have that like ability to be like, oh, I haven't read this in so long. I'm going to make this as easy as possible for you to get back into the series, so then you can read more. Or if you just want to read that book as like a standalone, you can.
That is one of the fun things about the Two-Faced Queen. And one thing that I've got to say is that even though this is a series, it reads, because this was actually the first book I read of yours, and I'm going to go back and read The Kingdom of Liars after um, um, it stood alone really, really well. I didn't feel lost. I got to know the characters really fast. I got attached to them. I thought you did a spectacular job with that. And it's
Thank you.
not an easy task for an epic fantasy writer to do. Oftentimes, you really need to have read that first book before you even touched the second or touched the third. Um, I remember as a Christmas present years ago when I was a teenager, um, my parents gave me the fifth book in David Eddings' Malorian series. As it turns out, that was like the last book in that series.
Yeah.
So I had to go back through and I had to start with Pawn of Prophecy and the Belgariad, read those 5 books, and then read the 4 others before I read that fifth. Thank God I loved that series so much and I loved the characters. But that was a 10-book investment or
Yeah.
9-book investment before I could read the 10th to know what was going on. So for me, and that was one of my big introductions into epic fantasy. I was probably 13 at the time. That and Lord of the Rings. Those were the 2 series that I ended up reading. Um, so it's nice to read an epic fantasy that stands alone, and
Yeah,
but they go together really well
they do.
as well. You're gonna miss a few nuances,
Yeah.
but it isn't gonna be
It's it shouldn't like leave the reader completely confused. Like
right.
there's no way I can write a perfect book, a second in a series. At least I don't think I can. Maybe I'll in like 5 years I'll say differently. Is that there's gonna be some nuances missed, but I always never want to put it. I didn't want to leave a reader being like, oh, you have to start here. Like I want really want the reader to be like, oh, if I want to pick it up this, I can pick it up here. And that's something I kind of try to do with my third book too, which like it's a lot harder considering it's supposed to be like the third book. But it was something I really liked in the Dresden Files series by Jim Butcher, is that you can kind of pick up those books and there's a mystery or there's like a thing that's happening. And you can technically start with like the 5th or 7th or 12th book in that series as your first book, and it would more or less be like its own contained story with nuances going through. And that was something I really wanted to try to bring into the more epic fantasy like style. Like, and his stuff is urban fantasy, but I really wanted to make it into an epic fantasy series because I really like. I think sometimes we all read fantasy books where it's kind of like, oh, this is just like almost like the part like the halfway book to get to like the ending, or it's almost like there's not much happens, like there's no conclusion at the end of this book. And I really want to make sure like there's a beginning, there's end in every book, and you can read those books as standalone. And that's something that's really important to me as a writer, because it was important to me as a reader. So
Well, and coming from maybe a younger generation where our um, attention span is a little bit less too. We kind of understand that there's so many things vying for our attention between books and movies and television shows and video games, and
yeah,
right? It's hard to kind of justify all of that to do an incredibly long series and expect the reader to always be able to go back and read 4 or 5 books. Um, one of the things that I always like to talk about, uh, is different media that inspires you in terms of uh, what you're writing. So not only were you inspired by some great writers, but what
yeah.
else inspired you in terms of creating these genres?
I do play a lot of video games, which should really surprise no one considering my like chair. But so, like I'll be honest, like I was inspired by video games. Obviously the mediums are very different. Like I can't do anything close to some of the things video games do. I think player agency is a thing in video games that I always think about. Like, is there any way I can put that like almost reader agency into books? And the closest thing I could ever think about is like, oh, choose your own adventures, where kind of like the reader can dictate a story. But those are very limited in what you can do. And maybe I just like give me like I said, maybe 5 more years and I'll come up with a better way to do it. or like come up with a way that works in book format. But I really was inspired by the video games and what they can do. Like, because sometimes they take just like a simple concept and just like almost like blow it out as far as they can. And I really like that. And like that's kind of things I try to do with my own books. And sometimes they get really weird, sometimes they get really bizarre, just like books do.
Right.
But sometimes I think sometimes in my head, at least I love reading books. I read everything I can get my hands on. But sometimes I just want that almost like not mental break where it's like, oh, I just want to sit in front of my like TV or computer with like a controller and hit buttons and like watch things, because it almost like stimulates a different part of my head than reading does, and it allows me to like also just think about stories and like different things like that.
That is one of the things. I mean, video games have yet to replace books in terms of the depth of story and the depth of
Yeah.
narrative. We've gotten a few that might have been a little bit closer, maybe like God of War that came out in 2018 that really told a more cinematic story. But again, what you're talking about, that player agency, we haven't been able to sort of bring into something like epic fantasy yet.
Yeah.
That you do in video games. But I think then there might be some story loss associated with that if you were able to successfully do that. However, I do have to say that as time has gone on, I think that storytelling within um, video games, specifically as a media, have just improved immensely over the years. I mean, you think of what the first Assassin's Creed did to what the Assassin's Creed stories might be doing now, are quite a bit different. And it's over the course of 10 years, 15 years or so, to really change that. Books, they don't change as rapidly.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you write some really killer action. And so I almost felt a little gamified when I was reading through those in terms of how you were describing some of the movements and things like that. So did you use that medium as a way to write your action scenes? Or did you actually act them out yourself? What did you do to build up that action?
I the way I kind of treat action scenes are they should go on a lot shorter than you think they should, because I like this is like I can't say I was in like childhood fights, but I was in childhood fights where like it's never as dramatic as you think. Like it's not like people fighting with swords for a long time. It's usually just like one kid punches another kid and then it's done. So like I just kind of always remember that, where, and I played sports too, which I played football for a long time. And like, look, there's few things more terrifying than being hit with a guy who ended up going to the NFL, who picks me and the bag up and throws us down to the ground together. So like, I think I just took what I knew in life and where it's like, well, if I get hit in the face, I'm going to fall down, and brought it into the books. But I'll be the first to admit there is like a gamified element in some of my books, because like the way I can see action scenes is I do visualize them in my head, and I'm just like, how do like this character this and this, and then it like happens, and then I usually go through and I'm like, all right, there's the whole action scene. Now I got to make it more realistic, where like the guy who gets punched in the nose first actually like falls down, rather than kind of being like, oh, you haven't hit my second form now. Like I can't do that. I make it realistic. So
Yeah, well, absolutely, and you have to. Otherwise, you'll, again, you'll lose the reader a little bit. Although I do think of how much fun some of those are to read, I would think that it would be a lot of fun to write as well. I do a D&D group once every couple weeks. We get together, we talk, and then we play a dumb game. But it's always fun when you beat an enemy and you're like, okay, our DM says, how do you want to do this?
Yeah.
You kind of get that creative aspect of, okay, we're gonna do this, or this is gonna be how this enemy falls. And but you get to do that as a writer the entire trip, which is a blast. So Nick, what's next for you? I mean, in terms of, sounds like you're writing book 3. Are you beginning to plan out in your head book 4?
So I've handed in book 3. And at this moment, my agent's read it. He really liked it. So now it's off to my editors. We'll see what they think. And right now, I'm just kind of like messing around and doing other things. I'm working on the standalone. I keep talking about that, which probably means like my editors and agents are going to be like, all right, I guess we're going to see this soon. So because I keep mentioning it in interviews like this, where I'm like, oh, I'm liking the standalone I'm working on. But I'm working on kind of more side projects right now, and then based on like how my editors respond to book 3, I'll work on like maybe book 4, and hopefully, or like we'll talk about what the next step is. That stuff is kind of sadly outside of my control. But I think no matter what happens, I really want to write the standalone next. It's really just a worm that's burrowed into my brain, and I can't let it go. And like I haven't like been able to fully like unleash the whole thing, like have it be my sole thought. But I really want to. Like it's really cool. It's different than a little different than the Kingdom of Liars and Two-Faced Queen, but almost a different vein of fantasy. And I really want to write it. It's yeah, that's it.
Well, it sounds like you really should. It was funny because Kevin Hearn, who writes the Iron Druid series, formerly of Phoenix, Arizona. And so we were talking with him, and when he started the Plague of Giants series, he said this is something that he'd always wanted to write, but he wasn't a strong enough writer at the time to be able to write that book.
Yeah.
But he had always had the idea kind of within his head. So he said one of the great things about writing the Iron Druid series was it gave him the writing chops and the writing experience to write the Plague of Giants. And for him, once he was able to get that out onto the page, it sort of opened him up for continuing on in that same Iron Druid universe. And yeah. I think that that's really important. I think that you need those breaks to, and the readers sometimes enjoy those breaks.
Yeah, and it's especially like we talked about a little bit, like long series. Like as a writer, sometimes I'm so limited by what I can do and can't do, like even just narratively wise or structure wise. And obviously, like the more the books go on, I get more and more creative. Like stuff I do in book 1 is vastly different from some of the like narrative stuff I do in book 2 and book 3 in comparison. But because I'm restricted by all these rules I set up, I can't really do almost different things. I have to play within the rules and almost twist them. But especially with taking refreshers, like a different series or like spreading standalone, it allows me to kind of be like, all right, there's no rules again. What do I want to do? And that's the thing. Like it helps me level up. Like as a writer, you kind of like constantly can push yourself as like, okay, I did it this way in this thing. Let me try something completely different over here.
Exactly. And then the next series that you write is only going to be stronger because of it. And that is what's so cool. Nick, no doubt you are going to have a long and interesting career writing.
Thank you.
Your publishing house, I believe you are published by Saga Press here, and they're really promoting your book as well. We still have a few signed copies left of The Two-Faced Queen. So now is your time to kind of audience to pick up his book. I don't think you're going to be disappointed at all. Nick, you are a fantastic writer. Congratulations on a new book. Well deserved.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. To our audience, we're going to say good night. Nick, do you mind hanging on just for a moment?
Absolutely.
Excellent. All right. So from Nick and I at the Poison Pen, have a wonderful night. Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Hello. We hope you're enjoying our programs and podcasts with authors. We'd like to expand them, and your help would be appreciated. Please make a donation at poisonedpenfoundation.org. 100% of the proceeds will go to help connect authors with readers in this difficult time. Thank you.